Resume recording.
Special session.
Did it not get erased?
Oh, yeah, it just didn't get updated, but the agenda is correct.
Got it, cool.
Yeah, we're ready anytime you're ready to bring us together.
Cool, all right. Thanks for joining everyone. Friday, October 7th, Homeless Solutions Council meeting. We have space for public comment, if anyone.
Do we have anyone in the room, in the virtual room rather?
Virtual room, yeah.
We have one public.
Sorry, I'm unable to get in. I think we have one, Diana just messaged, she's stuck.
Anyone
Oh,
raising
she
their hand
said,
for
she
public
said she'll
comment?
be late, sorry.
All right.
Okay, no public comment, all right. I just want to also have on the record that Drew Williamson, Vice Chair, running the meeting in place of Kim, Chair. And our first item is the consent agenda, and so I'll turn it over to Nicole to introduce that.
All right, folks, we have a consent agenda item. Washington County's Public Housing Authority is applying for COC resources to build permanent supportive housing. As part of this application, we're required to submit a letter of approval and support from the COC board. As you know, the Solutions Council serves as our COC board and then and our SHS oversight and much more. So Kim has agreed to sign onto a letter. It was included in your materials today, supporting the application to build permanent supportive housing in Washington County. So this is a bit of a formality. Happy to answer any questions should you have them. And if not, I would turn things back over to our chair.
Of course, this is a distinct silo of money.
Yes, so
Okay.
it's a great question. I can't remember the exact amount. HUD put out a pocket of resources for the capital construction of permanent supportive housing. Washington County had a competitive open request for proposals. The Housing Authority was the only entity to apply. So that is our application that we're now developing and submitting to HUD for this what I understand to be fairly competitive resource.
So the motion to approve the consent agenda item indicating the approval of a letter from our chair in support of Washington County COC permanent supportive housing application is before us. I will accept a motion to move the consent agenda forward to a vote.
So moved.
Thank you. And may I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. The motion has been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Oh, all right. So we will now vote on the motion to approve the consent agenda item, indicating the approval of housing inventory counts. That's not, indicating the approval of a letter of the chair to support Washington County COC, supportive housing application. And all in favor, say aye. Or raise your hand.
Aye.
Thank you. All in favor, all opposed, say nay. Okay, after the vote, the motion is passed. Thank you.
Assuming there was no abstains. No.
And Nadia, subcommittee updates.
Yes, okay, so let me. All right, so at this meeting, we are actually missing a couple folks who would usually be giving these subcommittee updates. So I'm gonna quickly run through. We had the performance evaluation subcommittee. They were able to discuss the ESG outcomes with Family Promise and oh gosh, now I'm spacing. Oh, the clogs and the coordinated entry system and shelter long stayers. So we have all the materials on our site if anyone's interested in going over them. Did Kim manage to join? Okay. Catherine, would you like to add anything? You don't have to, but if there's anything you wanted to add to that update.
No, I think I'm good if you can hear me. Thanks.
All right, yes, thank you. Okay, and then for equitable procurement, we have Jim here who is present, and we had the HUD NOFO ratings that were reviewed by the committee, and then they met to go over the ratings. And again, the summary of that is up on our site. And Jim, would you like to add a few words?
Yeah, I don't have much to say about it. There were applications that were ongoing from previous years, all of which were ranked in the same order as before. There was one that was a first-year applicant which had no data, and that was included in things that would probably be funded in the tier 1 to tier 2, which I don't understand, so don't ask me. And then there were 3 new applicants that we all graded on a scale, 2 of which seemed to meet the criteria, and then they were kind of put at the bottom, and they may be funded if there's extra money.
All right, and then lastly, lived experience. We're gonna be meeting next week. And our focus is gonna be on coordinated entry and really just delving into their experiences and the issues related to coordinated entry. We will not be recording that meeting, but we will post notes in that so folks can follow along if they're interested.
Thanks, Nadia.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next agenda item is the HUD consolidated plan. Shannon and Eve.
Great.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here with your group. You guys do have the PowerPoint, right? Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Shannon Wilson, and so I'm the program manager of the county's Office of Community Development. So we're a small team. There's about 11 of us, but we are a distinct component of the county. And so a lot of the work we do is administer federal funding. And so the consolidated plan is a 5-year plan that we put together that sets goals and priorities for how we're going to award those funds throughout the community during that 5-year period. And then I wanted to ask Eva, you can introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Eva Polly, and I am a housing and community development specialist working in the Office of Community Development. And I've been doing a lot of the coordinating of this process.
Great, and so for our time with you today, we were going to give some preliminary findings from the community engagement work that we've done as a part of this plan, as well as some of the findings and from the needs and market analyses that also go into the consolidated planning work. And then some draft goals that we have for as we think about how we would use the funds that we have, how we would deploy the funds we have, you know, what goals we use to guide that work. So first, as I said, the consolidated plan is a 5-year plan. And so based on the allocations we receive annually from HUD, we estimate that over the 5-year period, that'll be about $35 million. And so it's interesting, you know, I know in this committee, a lot of your work is overseeing some work at the SHS, Supportive Housing Services measure. And so there's just been such a significant influx of local funds to support this work. And so now 35 million over 5 years, and then the continuum of care funds, that used to be really all of the funds that were available for, you know, to support low and moderate income households in the county. And so it's so wonderful that we have the SHS funds. I know that now 35 million over 5 years looks pretty small, or is a relatively small amount, but we are still committed to using it, and now thinking about how we can use it most strategically, or ways that maybe complement the local funds as opposed to duplicating them, or things that we can fund that are kind of outside maybe the realm or outside the geographic areas of what the other local funding can support. So the consolidated plan is built on this intensive community engagement process, so which we are nearly at the end of. So we have one more open house tonight, actually, at Centro Cultural in Cornelius. Last night we were at the Tigard Library. So definitely been working hard to get a lot of input from the community. And then finally, part of the reason we do this work is because it is required by HUD to continue receiving those annual allocations of funds. And the 3, I don't think we have that slide in this presentation, but the three main types of federal funding that we receive are the Community Development Block Grant, the Home Investment Partnerships Program, and the Emergency Solutions Grant. All right, so we can move into the next slide. So for our community engagement work, we did a lot of stakeholder consultations. We did go like to the HISN, the Housing and Supportive Services Network, met with a lot of the same organizations that maybe you represent or work for, as well as others that you're familiar with in the community. So we conducted consultations with all of the groups on this list. HUD does have some requirements around what kind of groups that we meet with. And then we also, just wanted to exceed that and really just connect with other groups in the community. And in addition to that, we conducted a survey. And so that was to reach general citizens throughout the county. It was an online survey, and then we also had paper copies available, as well as a mail out that we did to some of our clients that we knew were older in terms of their age, and also lived in more rural Washington County. And so wanted to get respondents from the whole, as much as possible, from the whole geography of the county. And so we had over 2,200 respondents to the survey. So we pull out Beaverton and Hillsborough because they each received their own allocation, specifically of the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG funding. And so we do this work in partnership with those two cities. And so that's why you'll see some information broken out specifically for those two areas. So most of the survey respondents identified as non-Hispanic white and owning their own home with household incomes above 100,000 a year, 45% of the respondents having that income. And then 37% of them having children living in their home. Although one thing that was interesting from the survey results are that we had a lot of smaller families responding, and we were seeing that in the demographics too, kind of a shift to smaller household sizes. And so this next slide has a lot of demographic information, but really our intent here was to look at the respondent profile, like who completed our survey versus the demographics of the county overall. And what we found is a lot of pretty good alignment in terms of the race and ethnicity of the respondents, as well as income levels. So I think, and I mentioned 45% had incomes over 100,000. I think just even as our median income has increased, there were just a lot of, it still is reflective of the demographics of Washington County. I think the one outlier here is just under age, and that's for the under 35 years old. And that's because for the county demographics, they are looking at children as well. And so our survey was geared towards adults, and so that's why that be skewed a little bit. And so then moving into some of the top outcomes from that survey, we asked about housing needs. And so you can see there the top results. So these were what people identified as being high needs. So the construction of affordable rental housing for older adults, and then permanent supportive housing really stand out as the top three for the county overall. And then some other, and also in Beaverton and Hillsborough, additional interest in rental assistance, right? Additional, identifying that as a need in those two cities. And then next we looked at facilities, because the Community Development Block Grant funds can fund community facilities as well. And so those top needs there were a mental health center, homeless shelter, and child care center. And with a couple outliers for Beaverton and Hillsborough around libraries for the city of Beaverton, and a center for abused children for Hillsborough respondents. We also asked about top public services needs by jurisdiction. And so there were a larger variety of services that we were asking about, or that were identified as being top needs. But you can see the top few in that category are mental health services, substance abuse services, rental housing subsidies, and then really pretty closely fair housing activities and childcare services. with again, a couple outliers, particularly for Hillsborough with domestic violence services, and then a little bit further down for housing information and referral. And then we finally asked about top infrastructure needs because our community development block grant can be used for things like sidewalk improvements in lower income areas or water line replacement in those communities. And so some of those top needs identified were road improvements, sidewalk improvements, broadband infrastructure, and street lighting. And so then moving into what we found in terms of housing needs and gaps. So this was taken more from data and data analysis that we work with a consultant to do the analysis of primarily of American Community Survey data, as well as a variety of other reports that are in the community. And now a lot more cities are doing their own housing needs analysis. And so the consultant did review those as well as part of this analysis. And so what they've found, so the first slide is around rental gaps in the county as of 2022. That's the most recent American Community Survey data. And I think for a lot of you probably on this committee, it's not a surprise the gap in the number of units available for households at 0 to 30% AMI. But I think is what is interesting about this slide, and there's clearly a lot of information on it, but as you move up, there's a little bit of a surplus of units that are affordable in that 31 to 50, and then surplus also in the 51 to 80 AMI. But what's interesting is that it's really those other income groups that are kind of absorbing that surplus. So particularly if you look at the far end at 120 and above area median income. So those are renter households. So they're not, we'll get into home ownership in a minute, but so those households, they're at 120 AMI and they're not able to purchase a home. And so then that puts increased pressure on the rental market. And so it's a combination of those households who are really kind of essentially renting down, renting a unit that they can more than afford. And then they're kind of competing for the same units as those 0 to 30 households are that then are severely cost burdened if they are able to get an apartment that's in that 51 to 80% AMI range. And so the next slide shows that the same data, but in a table format. And so looking at the far right end of it, it looks at the cumulative affordability gap. And so it shows overall a gap in the number of units that are available that are affordable by income range. And so you'll see that 16,401 units, a gap in units that are affordable to extremely low income households. And then you'll see as they kind of get absorbed by the units that are affordable at higher income areas. But of course, that's just like at the units, it's not or can be able to afford a unit at a higher income level. So next we looked at home ownership and particularly home ownership gaps by race and ethnicity. And so this does break out again, Beaverton and Hillsborough, as well as the city of Tigard, and looking at those home ownership rates by ethnicity. And so you'll see for Washington County overall, the Asian population has the highest rate of home ownership, followed closely by non-Hispanic white. And then it pretty significantly drops off. So with 46% rate of home ownership for individuals or households with more than 2 races. And then from there, really stepping down further with the Hispanic and Latino population, Black and African-American population, and then American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. So clearly a lot of work to do in this area. We also found that when we looked at 2017 versus 2022, there was a decline in the rates of homeownership, particularly for the Black and African-American community. And so that's something that we were really looking at and thinking about how we can potentially address as we identify our goals and then look at organizations we can fund with the funds we have available. So this next slide, it takes the same approach as looking at the rental units available kind of by income level, but looking at housing and looking at home ownership, excuse me. And so clearly at the 0 to 30% AMI and 31 to 50% AMI, there are not any, really no homes that are available for purchase at those income levels. And really, there's not a lot of homes available for purchase that are affordable until you get up to 120% AMI and really above that income level. And so just really demonstrating what I was saying earlier about how the unavailability of even moderate or, households at that 120 AMI being able to purchase homes, just the pressure then it puts on the rental market. So just really made clear with this slide. And I think I just want to draw your attention to that. Sorry, just the narrative there on the right-hand side. So it says most of the county's homes for sale are too expensive for potential first-time buyers. So instead, the homes are likely purchased by the county's current homeowners or high-income buyers from elsewhere in the Portland metro region. So people are purchasing homes, they already have equity from some other source, most likely that they've already been able to purchase a home. And so then similarly to that last set of slides, this one is the same data, just in a tabular format. And so it shows the cumulative gap there on the right-hand side of home ownership rates for those different income levels. And so this slide looks at the current and then projected future needs. So looking out another 5 years as we think about sort of coming up with our consolidated plan for this period, and then what might it look like as we look ahead to the next consolidated plan cycle. And so we are seeing growth in terms of the numbers of low-income households overall, and I would say pretty modest growth, and they just take it's just really a trend line that they're completing. So just kind of looking at the demographic data from 2017, 2022, and then drawing a trend line out. So definitely there can be other factors that impact this growth. So it is a pretty conservative estimate in that sense. And so I think that generally demonstrates what we would know is that, the need does continue to grow. I think particularly though, one thing to point out is with elderly and low income households, we see particular growth in that area. So then moving ahead to looking at goals and priorities. So our group has taken all of this kind of data analysis and worked with our consultant to then roll that up into some goals. And so wanted to move into the priorities. And so the guidance and priorities are kind of like lenses that help us determine what goals then we are going to set. And so kind of how we're going to approach the work essentially. And so the main guidance areas we are using are first the urgency of the need. So of course, wanting to support things where there is an urgent need, being able to address equity gaps and reverse effects of historical discrimination. And then the ability to leverage resources and utilize other resources to increase the capacity of Washington County service providers. So that's a component where we want to kind of work and complement with other funding that's available in the county. And then moving to our goals. So with that, using that kind of guidance, then these are the 4 goals that we've come up with for our next consolidated plan cycle. I will say, for those of you who may have been around for the last consolidated plan 5 years ago, or I know some have even been involved prior to that, there were many goals. Like we had, I think there were 16 goals in our last consolidated plan, and then like 90 objectives. And so we really work to kind of right size the goals. I mean, you'll see they're still pretty broad, but to right size the goals for the process and for the funding that we have available. And so so these are the 4 goals that we have. The first one is around increasing housing stability of low-income renter households and special populations. So that can look like rental assistance. It can also look like new construction of affordable rental housing, as well as preservation of rental housing, and then housing-related public services. The second goal is to improve public facilities and public infrastructure that benefit, again, those special needs populations, as well as historically underserved people and neighborhoods. And then the third goal is to facilitate affordable home ownership and preserve and stabilize existing homes that are occupied by low and moderate income owners. So that can be down payment assistance. It can also look like housing rehab. We do currently have a housing rehab homeowners that are stable and safe in their housing. And then the last goal is to fund supportive services for low and moderate income households and special needs populations. And so on the next slide, we describe our definition of special needs populations. So I know there can be a lot of kind of different definitions, maybe of special needs populations or homelessness, but so these are the definitions that this is what we mean when we talk about special needs populations. So seniors and frail seniors, people with different kinds of disabilities, including mental illness and substance abuse, adults and youth at risk or experiencing homelessness, leaving a publicly funded institution, or people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, and then kind of also catch all for extremely low and very low income individuals. And then some HUD defined limited clientele. So some groups that HUD kind of tells us that we should work with. And so definitely those are important groups as well. I've just, they didn't kind of surface to the top in terms of special needs populations through the engagement and outreach that we did, but there's still groups that we are looking at in this process because of that HUD designation. And so next we were just hoping to get some input or feedback. So we have some questions to kind of start the conversation, but just really interested in any impressions or feedback or thoughts or questions that you may have. So particularly as it may align with the work that your committee is already doing, and yeah, just open to any thoughts or feedback that you have. So thank you.
In terms of those goals, you mentioned the last consolidated plan had a lot of those kind of sub-objectives that were all kind of rolled up into the overall goals. The youth-specific ones that we had helped guide the Transition Age Youth Subcommittee that I chair. And I'm just wondering, are there any of those specific objectives that we can kind of use and help guide our work moving forward? That, like, do you have any sub-objectives to the overall goals that we could see?
Right, so we were, so we have not, so we were kind of moving away from that, that approach with the idea that kind of balancing being specific about what we want to fund and then being broad because it needs to last for 5 years. So, so that is helpful feedback to know that you use them in that way. That was something we were trying to understand too, is are they, you know, are they useful? So.
They were, yeah, just kind of a guiding focus, right, to kind of help make sure that we were in the right direction and that the work we were doing was kind of always aligned with those goals. It was, yeah, it was helpful for us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's great feedback.
It's nice, I mean, now it's a little bit more focused, so we can make sure our goals are aligned with, or our work is aligned with those goals.
I have a couple questions, just to go back, not even to get to the goals. My first question is about your survey. How did you said how did you distribute this survey?
Yeah, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so we did a mailing to our housing rehabilitation clients that are in the program that our office administers, which is a lot of people who are elderly or with disabilities, who may not have the same level of computer access. We also distributed the information about the survey to a lot of our community partners. So a lot of the nonprofit organizations that we work with.
That was the one that was listed, right? Like all those listed partners.
Those were involved in the consultation, so it was a lot of the same,
Okay.
most of those organizations also received the survey information, but there was even more than that we kind of
Okay.
did the reach out to about the survey. It was, we had a lot of our jurisdictional partners spread the word about it, so it was in I'm not remembering what they're called exactly, but like the Hillsborough mailing that they do to everybody, and it has information about community events. So that was in there. It was in this similar thing for Beaverton. It was all over our social media. It was all over all of the other jurisdictions' social media and available in all of the libraries and in a lot of like public places. So we tried to do kind of a wide breadth of getting some community.
What kind of response did you get from the mail outs to the people who are in your program already?
We got around, I want to say it was around 100 responses back from that. Which for them, like mailing it back, I was happy.
So I have one more question that I have trouble with. Can you go back to the slide of the housing needs, the bar graphs? Going with the big bar graph, back a couple,
Yeah, that one.
that one.
Yes.
To somebody who's naive would say, well, it looks like there's housing available, but nobody can afford it. I mean, it can't be that simple.
I mean, I have a question, this is a bit out of school, Chair, I hope it's okay. Just to help with Jim's question, how does this compare to the Oregon housing needs analysis? Does this align with the findings of the needs in Washington County with that state-run process?
That's a good question, and we are working with land use and transportation to look at is that the one you're talking about with DLCD?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, so they have a different methodology, which is interesting, and so that was something that land and transportation was interested in, because the outcomes were pretty different. And so we are working on looking at, why the outcomes were so different from that. Because the analysis that the DLCD did was showing a need for significantly more units than this analysis was showing. So that's kind of a work in progress for that. But yeah, I think the way this is described, showing that kind of surplus, I mean, I think that's not, it is when you're looking specifically at that income level and what they can afford, but it's not a surplus in terms of the overall units available to everyone. It's that those units are being rented by people in different income, kind of different tranches of whether they're lower income than that area or they're higher income. And so there isn't really a surplus overall. It's that they're the types of units available aren't matching up with the income levels that people have throughout the community.
And if we looked at this same graph from Multnomah or Clackamas counties, how would they compare? Or just as your guess, I know you don't know that, but are they going to look the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's something for us to look at. We've been so focused on, Washington County or the cities within the county, but that would be something interesting to know.
Is there any way for us to take into account the 0 to 30% AMI households that are in the higher income level units because of, the supportive housing services programs that we have, vouchers, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think with this data, it doesn't get at that. We do have so this is just some of the information from our housing needs analysis work, and so there may be more information in there. I know it can be hard to kind of tell that from the data, like if you're looking at census data and then trying to see is someone in a unit because they have a subsidy or for some other reason.
I could offer that the housing authority oversees about 5,000 vouchers, so 1,500 from Arla. So far, about 1,100, 1,200 are in use. But many other voucher types from the federal government and such. And then, so if you think about 5,000 fitting in, and then they would only fit in, I think, up to the, well, somewhere they can't fit in because they have a rent cap that they are allowed, right? Right, and I can't translate FMR to AMI, I'm not that quick, but probably they can't be rented in units that are above 100% AMI, maybe not even above 80% AMI, I'm not sure. Others know that
Yeah.
translation?
Fair market rent is typically 100, what is affordable to 100% AMI.
Okay, thank you.
And then there's also a lot of renters that are renting below, below their AMI, so probably balances out a little bit.
But I should get my impression away from the fact that says there really aren't 31,000 surplus housing units available.
Exactly not, Jen.
I think the next slide like captures that kind of cumulative gap a little bit better.
Yeah, kind of showing the absorption, so if the, just the units available, and so if a 0 to 30% household could rent kind of any of those units available, then they do get kind of absorbed, but there's still a gap there of that 3,562 units affordable overall to households at 0 to 60% AMI. So, well, thank you very much for your time, and if you have any other thoughts around the goals, or if there's other ways that could be helpful as you think about the work of this committee too, or like your comment about the objectives, yeah, please feel free to reach out to us. And so in terms of our timeline, we are kind of coming to an end with our, like I said, with our community engagement, and then we'll be finalizing a draft, and we will have a kind of a formal public comment period as a part of that. But happy to take any input now really through the end of the year, and then we'll start to really finalize our draft. So thank you for your time. Oh, yeah, we did have a timeline slide there, so.
Just making sure we didn't have any questions online,
Oh,
right?
okay.
No, didn't look like it. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item, I'll turn it over to Nadia and Nicole for a discussion of recruitment and bylaws.
Yeah, so so we have 5 spots available in terms of expanding the Solutions Council. I believe 2 of those spots can be providers, and then that is the limit on providers that we have. And we're looking at who are the voices that are missing, that when you look around, you're like, oh, it'd be really helpful if we had someone from, this type of organization or this line of work or something like that. And so we just wanted to start having that discussion, and everyone online too. Oh, yes. Yeah, so there are some ideas that we've put forward there, which was folks who are tied to culturally specific organizations, chamber and business, landlord and property management folks, folks involved with the eviction court system. Each of those elements don't have to be like one person, like there could be a person who embodies multiple facets of that. So again, it's just open for discussion.
And looking for two more community partners, providers, and 3 more gyms, right? Sami citizens.
Well, if I could clarify, the 2 providers, just to provide clarity, is 2 contracted providers.
Okay.
Yeah, so we could have,
Okay, sorry.
no, you're right.
With one that I may consider.
And that's also, we can have, they don't have to be. Okay.
So we can have up to 2 more homeless services contracted providers.
That's, okay.
They don't have to be.
Well, I have a comment. So, you know, unfortunately, it seems like many of our future discussions are going to be more financially related than philosophically related. And I'll paraphrase Kim from our last meeting who said, you know, with our 3rd grade approach to finances, which, you know, I will take, it might be helpful to have people who have a more astute view of finances than, certainly than I do.
I'm just taking notes on my phone.
What about someone from Virginia Garcia?
Yeah, would click several of those
With
boxes.
several of those boxes.
The applications are technically open and rolling, right?
Yeah, it is. And I can send that out if it's helpful, if you want to pass it along to anyone. We do have some folks who have applied, so we'll be going over those. And then, you know, again, we're looking at, we're being a little bit more specific about what they're bringing to the group this time.
Do they have to live in Washington County?
Yes.
Live
They don't have
or
to
work.
work.
Live
Okay,
or
yeah.
work,
And Vernon has his hand up.
Oh, Vernon,
Oh, yeah.
and Abel, and then
That makes
Abel.
sense. Never mind, I don't live in Washington County. But it don't get changed per person, like if like the next round, sorry. It makes sense in my head. It's just all-
Good question.
For the end of the day.
Oh.
There's more sugar. I know, I've not had any food today. I forgot.
Vernon, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, no play.
Okay, I was gonna ask, do they have to be associated with SHS in some capacity to be eligible as a provider? Am I correct? Even if the program or the organization is not located in Washington County, but they're providing services in Washington County.
So they don't have to be associated with SHS or Washington County SHS programming.
Okay. All right.
I just want to throw it out there. With myself and Drew being some of like the few, like representing some of the few organizations that directly support youth that are experiencing housing hardship and housing instability, I would like to see at least one more person, one more provider that functions in that role. I know historically in these types of committees, people that work with youth experiencing housing instability have been few and far between. And so having additional voices to lift those people up and their families as well, I would really appreciate that personally.
Thank you.
I also want to ask, since FJC houses different agencies, would it be a conflict if we had one of our partner agencies apply?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. And then my second comment is maybe Centro Cultural. I know that they mentioned it. I know that they have a really strong program as well. So their agencies happen to. It's a great suggestion.
As the institute as well.
Would we want to stay away from multiple folks from one agency, I'm assuming? Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. What, did we decide on what the criteria was for like citizens at large and those sorts of, I mean, if they're, you said living or working in Washington County, so that's the main, okay.
Yeah, maybe they could just be a math whiz. apparently.
Yeah, find a math teacher.
They go after a CFO, one of the organizations.
Mhm, mhm.
How do we recruit for this? What does that look like?
Well, that is also open to ideas. We right now have been going through, so the county puts out the openings for the various committees and things like that. And so far we haven't pushed further than that because we're not like we weren't actively recruiting. But now we'll probably start putting it out. I know it'll probably go out on HISN. And I can send everyone else a little blurb if you want to share it out with your contacts, and then we can go from there. I don't know, I don't know how they did it last time.
Yeah, and I think for this group, we sent it pretty far and wide, and there was a few organizations that we called and said, we'd love to have your perspective. Diana, you were referenced by, or Rachel had referenced sending this on to you. So that's how we got some of you that are around the table. So if having organizations names is helpful, we can reach out to those organizations. That's the Solutions Council has identified you as an organization they'd love to have their voice included in. Some of you just applied through the opening, and we got some great voices there. So the application itself, as you remember, asked some great vetting questions to see who's interested, who's tracking, and who could offer a unique perspective. So I think the blurb now you mentioned would be great. We have some ideas and can follow up. And then good old word of mouth, we will probably put it in our upcoming newsletter and that sort of thing.
Yep. Might be helpful to identify like the agencies that do have representation, so that, I mean, because I can think of one person in particular from my agency that if there was an open roll call that they would likely apply. And so it'd be nice to call that out.
When you say the agencies, are you speaking of in the community, or are you talking about
Those
the
of us that are
committees in the
already here.
county? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. So it's like if you want to see the general listings for the county, that's available publicly.
Oh,
You can
for
send
us to
that
like
out, yeah.
recruit to the others, gotcha, yeah.
Yeah, let's get Housers on every board and commission.
Mhm.
Truly.
I don't know, I feel like there's another board that I was on that offered the idea of there being a youth person on the board. So someone who is a youth might be an interesting option, or a college student, someone who is college is there and might be an interesting perspective. And I don't know what that would look like, because when you open it up to someone who's under 18, it becomes a little, I don't know how that works. But anyway, just throwing it out there.
So maybe sorry.
No, I'm just throwing it out there, like an actual youth to have a voice. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I love that. We would have to make sure we have a mechanism to pay that person for their time to be here.
Correct. I think on one of the committees I was on in the Oregon Department of Education, they were not a voting member, but they were a member of the organization of the committee, if that makes sense.
I mean, for that point, would we be able to even open up a spot on this committee for anyone in the lived experience subcommittees? What I was just gonna mention.
Yeah, that was my next.
Yeah.
Because that's a voice that's not here.
Correct.
I can bring it up to them this week. Half of them do work at Bridges to change them, so. There was.
So the other
That's cool,
Yeah.
One of them works at
Good work there.
One of them works.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
Oh, Salvation Army, they support a lot of houses folks as well.
Great
Mhm.
suggestion.
I just reached out to the executive at Northwest Instituto to see if he has anybody that he would, because I know they have the office out here. I don't know where it's at here, but we partner with them on a lot of different things, and I know they had some like massive turnover recently, and so I wonder if they have anybody they want to do the professional development with, I guess. That'd be good.
Just highlighting about put some youth serving organizations in the chat.
Mhm. That's great, and I also just wanna uplift kind of some thoughts around bylaw changes as was noted at that kind of like early on when we were electing our chair and vice chair. There's potentially some interest in changing that to co-chair. We as staff have been kind of keeping a running list of things that would be sure nice to update to make the administrative work of bringing you all together easier. Including, potentially defining our stipends in there and our policy for stipends in the bylaws. There's some kind of updates to better fall in line with other reporting expectations. So, updating our reporting expectations to match the Board of County Commissioners and being 7 days of notice. And a few other pieces, like changing how often subcommittees meet. If there's not a need for them to meet, we don't want to convene folks just to have them sit in a room. And those sorts of things. So we'll send out the bylaws after this meeting if you want to take another.
They were sent
Oh,
out,
right.
but if I can send them out again if
Yes.
anyone.
Yeah, so they've been sent out, no need to speak them again. But just go through and look through them and see if you have any additional changes. We'll probably have a larger conversation on this because it's just a bit meatier in November. And that process is one we're expecting to work with your executive committee on kind of what they recommend to bring forward, and staff and the executive committee will bring forward some updates and amendments for you all to consider.
And we did also note, I know Kim shared something earlier about section 3 and section 8 not being consistent with one another in terms of the timeline. So that's been noted as well. Just want to note that.
Thank you. Any more conversation around either recruiting or bylaws before we move on? Heather.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Scriver. I am the Data and Evaluation Supervisor for Homeless Services Division. And I also, in that role, act as our HMIS System Administrator for Washington County. So I'm here because I want to bring you guys an update on some pretty important HMIS work that is happening in the region, and just kind of share that update and let you know what is happening, and give you a warning that there will be more coming as well. So let's see. To start with, I just want to give some background, and I realized after I sent the slides that I have some more background that would probably be helpful for this group. HMIS stands for Homeless Management Information System. It is a HUD required database structure for how you get data around homeless services, and those are served by your system. It has been something I think HUD mandated in like 2004 is when they started mandating this. And the Washington County has been using a specific tool through the vendor who is now known as WellSky since 2006. So we've been using the same tool for a really, really long time. And when we started using this HMIS, really, it was mostly used as a data and reporting tool. It was kind of like recording what happened after the fact, so that way we could pull the reports that we needed to pull to send over to HUD. But really, as needs have changed, as things have grown, especially with SHS, we've been trying to utilize our tool to be a lot more robust. We really want it to be more of an operational tool where we are getting data that helps us really understand beyond the needs of like what HUD wants us to collect. So we need to be able to understand system throughput. We need to understand who's on our wait list. We need to be able to use that tool to make sure there's collaboration across providers. So there's just a lot more needs beyond just getting the reports to HUD, essentially. And because of that, back in October of last year, Multnomah County's Department of County Assets, or DCA, engaged with a consulting firm called Gardner Consulting to complete a regional strategic technology analysis. This was led by Multnomah County because they are currently the owner of our HMIS implementation. So Washington County, Clackamas County, and Multnomah County, we've combined together to use one HMIS implementation, and it's managed by Multnomah County. This consulting process, the strategic analysis, was really, the purpose of it was to evaluate the regional needs for an HMIS system, identify the gaps between our current HMIS vendor and what our future state and what our true needs are for HMIS, Also to provide insights into the market of HMIS products available, and then provide recommendations to guide the region toward achieving our HMIS vision. In this initial process, there are a lot of stakeholder meetings across the region. They were mostly in November, and this included HMIS admins, program staff, provider agencies. We went to our quality assurance program group to get the direct provider feedback. I believe that maybe the old COC board was looped in at some point. I can't remember exactly, but there's a lot of voices to develop this needs analysis. And the key takeaway from that needs analysis was something that those who work intimately in HMIS already know, and that is that WellSky is not meeting our needs. That there are a lot of gaps. It is not as user-friendly as it needs to be. There's not as much, there's just a lot, it's hard to describe. There's a lot of gaps. I can't remember the exact number, but they did a business capability model, and they noticed like the needs of our system and what we could do in the system were significantly lower. And so the recommendation from this was that we launch a request for proposals to identify a new vendor who will be better equipped to fit our regional needs. Another thing I'd like to share out of this is one of the things that they did when they did a market analysis is they looked at the vendors that the top 15 COCs use across the region, which if you count, or across the nation, if you count our Tri-County region, we are actually in the top 15, and they established that based off of PIT counts. And we are the only ones using WellSky. Of the other 14 are predominantly using one of two vendors, and then Arizona has their own like homegrown solution. So this was another like compelling piece of information to understand that WellSky isn't really set up and equipped to handle a really complex large system. So now we are in this RFP process. The RFP is set to launch, I think November 1st is when they're publishing this. And to get to this RFP, Multnomah County worked with Gardner to conduct a lot of focus sessions with the Joint Office of Homeless Services staff in Multnomah County. They started with them because they did a lot of work. Essentially, I think they did multiple months, multiple focus groups. There's a lot of effort that went into this to develop business process maps and use cases for like what Joe's staff felt was the future state of an HMIS. Like they could have whatever HMIS they wanted, this is what they wanted. And then they drafted the RFP, created a set of requirements from that process, and then they forwarded that on to Washington County and Clackamas County so that way we could review and provide feedback to make sure that it was also meeting our needs. And we finished that review actually last week, and we were able to give them pretty good feedback on, some tweaks to make this actually fit the differences in kind of our processes and how we operate predominantly around coordinated entry. And so, like I said, the RFP is expected to be published. I said this month on the slide, but I learned on Tuesday, that's actually November 1st. And this will kick off a 4-stage process for review and selection of a new HMIS vendor. So the next slide kind of outlines a little bit of what this process is and who is going to get involved. I know it's a little bit hard to read. And also the timelines on this are already a little bit off. They've pushed some things off. It keeps changing every version of the slide I see. But essentially the first stage is just that initial response to the RFP, and it's what they do in auto score. So when people apply for the RFP, they're going to have a list of questions that are basically about the functional requirements that are listed in the RFP. And the questions are like, can you do this out of the box? Can you do this with some customization? Or can you not do this? And they score people to like screen them out and move people on. Then we go into stage 2, which is where, anyone who passes stage 1 will go into vendor demonstration. So they'll be giving us demos of their product, and then we'll be reviewing that and kind of screening people onto the next stage. This is where we'll start getting a lot of involvement from additional stakeholders. So there's different colored boxes to kind of represent who is in each of these stages. So the primary group is the scoring panel. That will be myself as the HMI system administrator for Washington County, and then we are also having someone from our programs team represent the Washington County needs as well. And we're gonna be the ones who do the official scores. Then there are multiple SME panels where we're going to get that additional feedback as well to inform our scores. And that includes a couple different SMEs. They're coming in at different stages. The Tri-County Leadership SME panel is in every stage, and that's, you know, Jess's level and her counterparts at the other counties, as well as some other program staff. We're still identifying exactly who was on there. Then there's the, what's called the Tri-County SME panel, that's additional staff at the each county. So this will be some people from my data and evaluation team, people who are more focused on the actual system administration, and someone who's focused on the data side. And then we'll have two additional panels. One is called the Tri-County Community SME panel, and this is where we are going to be looking for representatives from the COC boards. So they are looking for 2 from each county. I think we need to have some internal discussions more about this, but previously we had talked about setting up an HMIS technical subcommittee and identifying 2 members of that to be on this panel. And then there's also a provider SME panel. And that one is, again, they're asking for, well, they frame this as at least 2 providers that represent at least 2 service lines. One provider needs to be a smaller provider and one should be culturally specific. I imagine that there might be some overlap with our technical subcommittee and also our providers that we would identify for this. But this is something that we'll be starting to talk about, who do we bring into each of these panels. But I want to share that because there will be a lot of stakeholder feedback that goes into this process. So some will be in the demonstrations, and then it'll go on to the proposal and oral evaluation. So vendors who pass the demo will then have to give us a proposal of what they would actually provide us, and there will be some sort of interview essentially. And then again, vendors who pass on to that will go into the best and final offer stage, where they have some chance to tweak their proposal, come back to us, we can ask more targeted questions to make sure that whatever vendor we do go with will meet our needs to the best ability as we can find in the market. And they're hoping to make an actual selection by the end of May so that they can start going into the contracting process. So that's the basis of it. So mostly I've just brought it to the script so that we guys know what is happening. And then if you do have any thoughts on who should be in that community panel and the provider panel, I would really love to hear those as well. And also just whatever questions you have about HMIS in general and what this process means.
So there's gonna be actual like HMIS users in that provider and community panel.
So we might look for someone on the community panel who is also just maybe a need. I'm thinking like city liaisons who might have a need for data that comes out of HMIS and more information. But yes, we will actually have in the providers panel the actual users. And then I'm thinking the community, if we look for the technical subcommittee to make sure that at least one is a user. And figure it out from there.
Seems like a lot of work for a computer program.
Yes.
I'm not gonna lie.
It's a really important computer program.
100%, and I appreciate the stakeholder engagement. An additional question, how does an organization become eligible to use the HMIS system? How do we become eligible to do phase 1 assessments?
We actually have a phase 1 assessor only policy where we have a certain allocation of licenses that we pay for through SHS, where we can let people kind of apply to be a phase 1 assessor. I can't remember all of the criteria exactly, but it's based off of how often do you interact with people who are experiencing homelessness. And yeah, I can get the link somewhere. We have a link. I know this. We have a form
On
to
the county
request it.
website somewhere.
It might not be on the website.
Noted, Christina.
Throwing that out there. I do trust, but I would love that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then from there, like, we review it and kind of make sure it matches the criteria, make sure we have licenses available, and then if it gets approved, we'll have to, you have to sign an agency participation agreement, which is at the agency level, basically making sure that you're going to use it responsibly. And then every user has to get training and also sign a user agreement. But it can take a little bit of time because of that.
Is that application process for an agency or for an individual within an agency?
I think we've designed it with agencies in mind. Yeah.
So the estimated time that this new system will be online is a year from now?
Probably longer. It's hard to know because we're not going to be starting the contracting process until the end of May. And depending on how contracting and procurement processes go, I would not be surprised if we don't even sign a contract until the end of 2025. And then we'd have to move into the implementation, which will be pretty extensive. This will require a lot of, just thinking about, we have to redesign our workflows, we have to redo all of our training materials. So just that alone, we have to rebuild all of our reports and all of that infrastructure, so that way we can hopefully get this as seamless as possible in the transition. And we also have to get all the data in our current system mapped over and moved to a new system, test all that data, make sure that we're not losing anything. So I think it's going to be a pretty extensive implementation. What I will say is I think that this will take longer than anyone wants it to. Essentially, there is a lot of interest in moving forward as quickly as possible, but this is going to be a pretty heavy lift on all of the HMIS system admins and data teams at each of the counties. It's going to take some time.
And the basic improvements that we can expect to see when this happens, particularly as regarding coordinated entry?
We are hoping that there will be a lot of coordinated entry benefits, also just care coordination. One of the things that's really a struggle in our HMIS right now is case noting and being able to share information amongst providers very effectively. So that's one thing that we're looking to improve. We are definitely looking for some improvements in how coordinated entry works. Right now, we have to pull a lot of reports, we have to run things through a system, and we have to create our wait list and send it out. But we're hoping that we can get a tool where a lot of that work is done for us, so it's there in the system and people can see it more easily. And we're also hoping that with just more user friendliness, the data will be cleaner. A lot of people make a lot of data entry errors, and we spend a lot of time trying to clean up those data entry errors, trying to account for those data entry errors in our reporting. So we're hoping that with a better user interface, it'll be easier, like the system will prompt people to do the steps is what we're hoping for. We of course have to see what vendors can actually do, but that was kind of some of the asks of the system. We also want a lot more functionality for street outreach as well, including like geolocation tracking as well, so they can record actually where they were when they encountered someone through their street outreach works. There should be a lot more information available there as well. Another key benefit that we're looking for is just a better reporting tool and more direct access to the data. Right now we have, there's a reporting tool in the system, and we can schedule reports in the system, but we actually have to go manually get those reports out of the system every single day that we want to do our reporting. And there's a lot of limitations in that reporting tool. There's only so much we can do in that tool itself. So we have to do a lot of processing out of the tool. And that actually makes it more challenging for some of our providers to see information. There's like I'm going into a lot of detail here, but like there are expectations around how many service transactions or our version of case notes go in to a household in your programs every month. And we don't have a really good way for a provider, our quality assurance staff, for instance, to pull a report that shows them who are they missing, who hasn't gotten that number because of some of the challenges in our system. And so we're hoping that we'll get more robust reporting tools to make it easier for our providers to see like more data around things instead of having to do a lot of like manual searching and looking things up. So we're hoping that this will be a much more effective tool. I'm very optimistic about it. I've at least seen some of the other the two other vendors that are used by the largest COCs. And what they're at least selling on their website looks way better than our current tool. I also know some people who have used one of the vendors that we know is going to be applying, and they've said that yes, it's a much better tool. So we're optimistic.
Great answer, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Any other questions? All right. Great. Our next agenda item, I'll turn it over to Jess for an SHS budget update.
Certainly. Hi again, everybody. Meeting, discussion. Someone recently said to me that we don't hire caseworkers based on their ability to input data, but the way to solve homelessness these days is through data management and the complexity of that reality. Good news. So I'm back with updates on this ongoing conversation around scaling back, if you will, and these new budget realities or new financial realities with SHS funding. So to catch us up real quickly, we talk about there being 3 new sort of trends in the funding for SHS. 1, the trend of spending. This is good news, but it's good news sooner than was planned, which is our system is scaling up. Our partners have hired, our partners have housed, you all have housed and hired, and now we spend more month to month as a system, which is good. That's what we've been working towards. It's just more and sooner than was planned when we planned our current year's budget. Because that planning, there's methodology in forecasting of expenditures that goes into assumptions about what we'll need to spend, what we'll be able to spend in our current year's budget. So that trend. Second trend being that for the first time, the regional forecast, which is what also informs our budget, was actually higher than actual revenues received. It wasn't significantly different. It was through $6.5 million, I believe it was, that we did not receive, that was forecasted in November. But what's significant is up until that point, the forecast had always been a significant underestimate. And so we had a lot more resources. And so we've been in this space of grow, spend. We have to build faster. The need is great and we can't be sitting on resources. Well, for the first time, like, whoa, okay, we've reached the capacity of this revenue system. And then the third component is those early year trends of underspending and over collections or unanticipated collections led to carryover funds, which allowed us a lot of flexibility for longer term planning. And we have a long list of projects and program commitments that had been made that were going to be spent out of that one-time carryover fund balance, or that are going to be funded, but we didn't have any additional carry forward that moved over. It was much less than what was planned. And we're spending more from there too. So we're seeing restraints on both sides of our current year's budget and also that carryover budget that is helping with some of those one-time commitments, both capital and programming. So those are the trends. We talked about all of this with you all when it first came to light, and then we had a longer conversation with more information and hopefully a memo you've been able to sift through with all of that information kind of densely laid out. And then the newest update since we've all been together is that we've also chatted with our board about that memo and these realities and the staff recommendations. So we went through what was basically within the memo with our board, and they sort of greenlit staff's recommendations to move forward. But what moving forward means is find ways to reduce spending without impact as much as possible, delaying new program launches or program expenditures that hadn't been contracted yet, delaying some hiring, other ways in which we can hopefully realize some cost savings without significant impact. Communicate. So we're hoping to keep working on that with you all and our contracted providers, the whole network. Prepare ramping down of programs that were funded with that one-time bucket that is now being exhausted and we know will not be able to be afforded next year. we won't be able to continue those temporary programs. Drew, I think you mentioned this last time we got together to talk about what those programs are specifically. There are two different programs that weren't envisioned to be long-term funded: eviction prevention, and we have some motel voucher programs. We have many shelter programs that are in motels, but we have also shelter programs where they sort of rent rooms by the night, or they have a block lease that are renting rooms on the market. We don't own those shelters. And so those two programs, we don't have capacity for in our long-term budget. They were in a continuation of COVID era funding when we ramped up and we quickly got resources out the door, and that funding went away and the SHS funds were there in that carryover fund. So we wanted to sort of continue them, especially since we had those resources. But as those now expire, we won't have that to continue. So we've begun conversations with the impacted partners about what does a mindful transition and ramp down look like, so that we're very respectful of impacts to staffing and impacts to community members who are in need. Eviction prevention is, I just want to speak to this, well, I'll speak to both quickly because this is kind of the most critical part. And something where we're going next with you all, where we're going next in our staff planning, and where we'll want to come back to you with more detailed information. Let's see, eviction prevention is an important intervention to prevent homelessness, which, as you know, SHS funds are supposed to help contribute to prevention of homelessness too. We talk a lot about population A and population B. The 75% of our resources need to go in population A. Sorry, Jim, this must all sound like a broken record after a while. And that means, 3/4 of our money has to get spent on ending chronic homelessness, and 2/4 can get spent on those folks who've been short-term homeless, or, are homeless for economic reasons only, and people who we don't ever want, helping people not become homeless. So that's a smaller pot of the resource. And we just are wrapping up our annual report from this year, and it's important to share with you all that we are not at 75-25. We are actually at 58-32. Wait, I'm not doing the math right.
I think it's
58-40. We're under 60% in our commitment to
58-42.
Thank you.
Better remember me.
To the population A. And actually, eviction prevention and resources are such a big part in population B that is really where the swing is and how we're going to balance it out. Now, it was the right investment to make when we were building and trying to get resources out, but as we're having to make sure we're achieving the commitments of the SHS program and we're resourced constrained, it's also going to be the necessary place for us to pull back. Our goal is not to pull back entirely, but we're going to be going through kind of a correction year or two where we really rebalance the system so we can do all of the interventions that are needed to meet people where they're at and then move them through disability and achieve that 75-25% goal of focusing on chronic homelessness. So those conversations have begun with those impacted providers for those two programs to scale down this fiscal year because we won't have resources in the next fiscal year's budget. Eviction prevention we just spoke of. Around the motel vouchers, it's also important to know that a lot of that permanent shelter capacity that we've been planning for is actually starting to come online. Vernon's left us, but his shelter hopes to be opening before the end of the fiscal year, and that will be an additional, I think, 40 beds in Tiger. They have 20 now and they're going to 60. And this winter, in the next couple of months, Beaverton will be opening and they'll be moving their 40 shelter bed into a 60 shelter bed program. So we are seeing places where additional capacity is coming online. And so the scaling back of that much more expensive motel voucher program makes sense. But again, we have to do that long-term right sizing our system. I do this a lot because we want the balance. We don't want people to get stuck in shelter, but we also don't want only housing and not have options for people who are in the moment of emergency and crisis with homelessness. So that's what our next step is. We'll be convening as a staff leadership team next Friday. We actually have some Monopoly pieces in many different colors, and we're going to do some planning together in teams. Like, what would the right amount of shelter types and intervention of housing types and rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing look like in a system, so that there was that balance, and then we would scale it up and scale it back as a system depending on resources as they became available. And as we have some ideas emerge through that staff planning work, that is exactly the conversation we want to bring back to you all and get further feedback and insight from your experience about, like, how do we have enough of the right amounts of interventions along the spectrum, so that we can move people through into out of homelessness and into housing stability. And then that will help us for that long-term stability, because as you know, these resources are volatile. We hope that the economy stays strong, and this kind of setback of about $10 million, $15 million that we're planning for next year isn't $10 or $15 million the year after that, or, you know, other that right. This rebalance is not happening in the state of an economic downturn. It's happening in an economically stable time, but we have to be mindful of those possibilities. And I think I'm overstaying my welcome. So we want to have that roadmap that will flex with us as we need to flex. And I think it's worth mentioning here, and really not to cause alarm in any way, but there's still conversations at the regional level about the long-term funding source and other changes that might happen through a ballot measure. So another reason that we're really working to create stability in our system and for our partners, so that we aren't having these kinds of moments in the future, and that we have a base budget that we can confidently sustain every year. And then when we have additional good years, when we have additional funds from good years, we can kind of insert them into the system with flexible funds like eviction prevention and move-in dollars on top of that baseline system. So that's our update. And I'll keep coming and bringing those conversations to you all. I think our board wants us to come back in November when we have the new forecast and some of this balanced system conversation kind of further developed. But we'll bring that conversation to you all first, and hopefully in the next couple of meetings, depending on how staff planning goes.
So reading, you know, from the governor's perspective, eviction prevention seemed to be one of her prime goals.
Yeah.
Are you hopeful that you're going to get some significant money from that may offset some of this difficulty? I mean, I think we all agree eviction prevention is, you know, is really cost effective.
That's and so is housing, right? Like it's all it's all cost effective, but yes, you can serve one household for a lot less dollars, but it's a different household than you would be serving who's in, right? But yes, is a better answer to your question. We are hopeful. It will be a resource constrained legislative session as well. There are many more asks in the housing world on the table than there are dollars. But I think especially since COVID era funding has dried up across the state, eviction prevention needs are being heard across the state, and rents continue to rise. There's also the opportunity of Medicaid HRSN dollars that will roll out in their initial phase focused on eviction prevention. So our partners who are currently providing eviction prevention in Washington County, Central Cultural and Community Action are also both engaged in the HRSN conversation and Medicaid, and hoping to learn how to tap into those resources.
There's
So
a meeting about
yes,
that next week to like train on all that information.
it's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Any other comments, questions?
Well, I really appreciated your earlier thought, like finances are gonna be a big part of our conversation. And we really look to you all to help us. I mean, finances is just what your budget is, just a moral document, right? Like so like it's the same work you've always been doing. How do we make these tough decisions now that we aren't living in a world of abundance? We're living in a world of realities. There's a lot of resource to work with, but we're gonna have to make choices.
Nadia, you've got 4 minutes for your announcements.
All right, well, I want to quickly just mention that we will be sending out a save the date for the December luncheon, and that will be Monday, December 16th. Okay, okay, that was the most popular from the result from the poll. The other thing I want to quickly mention is, so as members of the Solutions Council, we've kind of defaulted you to receive messaging or communications from our communications team. So when there's like openings or events or things like that, or like we have the housing forum coming up, you all get invitations to that. Our communications team just wanted to make sure that that was okay with everyone. And if anyone wanted to opt out, like you don't want to receive these kinds of notices or invitations, please just let me know and I will let them know.
Question about the housing forum, are we allowed to bring people from our work, or is it only specifically for us?
It's a great question. We're challenged by space constraints.
Yeah.
We can only have 80 to 100 people attend, so perhaps for now, just you, and then if you have additional interested parties, if you wanna just email Nadia or myself, and when we have the RSVPs, we can say, yes, let's open it up. But we're expecting a large turnout. We're really lucky, just heard today that we'll have Senator Jama, who chairs the Senate Housing Committee, the Oregon Senate Housing Committee, and Senator Lieber joining us, and Senator Lieber is the holder of the purse strings in Salem, so we're really grateful to have her coming down, or well, her district includes Washington County, so this is her community, but we're really grateful to have her to joining us as well.
And Hannah, all the ED directors of all the organizations got invited. So if that's a person you were hoping to bring.
Who's our regional manager for Washington County? He's new at getting involved in things.
Yeah, I think reach out, we'll find a way to help.
Okay, cool. Yeah, he's new into what he's doing, and I think it'd be really helpful for him.
That's it.
I might add just one thing. I want to thank you all for being here past the 60-minute time. We've kind of scheduled out to be 90 minutes, and for the meeting coming in next, Chelsea, you're welcome, just fine. So we'll probably do that for the foreseeable future, just in terms of it's easier. If this is a challenge to extend to 90 minutes, please let us know. If Drew has shared that it's challenging to be at the back end of the hour, if that's challenging for you, please let us know. I think particularly when it comes to 2025 meetings, maybe we can adjust the time.
All right. Well, do I need to say anything other than we are adjourned? There we go. Adjourned.
Well done.
Well
Drew.
done.
Well done.
Co-chair
Thanks,
Williamson.
Appreciate it.
You did great. I didn't even notice it.
Ooh, don't let
You're
kids
off
hear
re-
that.
you're off record for that, okay.